This is the third, and you'll be happy to know last lecture on Jesus as miracle worker. In fact, this will be very brief, but I did want to talk a little bit about the miracle stories that are unique to John's Gospel. Remember that Robert Fortin said that chapters 2 through 12 were built around seven miracles. The two of those are shared with the synoptics gospels. I'm all of a sudden blanking which ones those are. But anyway, the ones that are found only in John's gospel are the ones I've listed here. The marriage at Cana is a very interesting one, and the study of the way John treats the parable or the miracle stories is an interesting study. I'll just hit a few highlights here. Where this is, of course, where Jesus changes the water into wine. For those of us who like wine, we definitely want to thank Jesus for this. It turns out to be the absolute, the best wine that is served. Jesus did this, and it's called the first of his signs in verse 11, chapter 2, verse 11. Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And notice again the sequence here of miracle first, belief later. That doesn't make Jesus real happy in John's Gospel. But notice, too, that in John's Gospel, these miracles are used to reveal Jesus' glory. And I hope that you all remember that it's at the crucifixion scene, or the anticipation of the crucifixion of Jesus in John's Gospel, where that is called his hour of glorification. So the miracle working and Jesus's being raised from the dead, actually being crucified and eventually raised from the dead, there's a sense of connection there in John's Gospel. It's a pretty powerful one. So if we turn to chapter 5 in John's Gospel and look here for the miracle story here, this is at the pool of Bethsatha. There's a wonderful spiritual based on this. Come to the water, children. It sings about Jesus going to stir the water, and the tradition there was that if somebody was able to, the water was stirred from time to time, and people would go there to be healed, and anyway, there it is, verse 7. The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." And anyway, the guy doesn't even have to go in the water. Jesus says, "Stand up, take up your mat, and walk." This is another example of where there's no touch involved. It's just the word of command from the Logos. And at once the man was made well, took up his mat, and began to walk. And then, of course, this leads into a controversy story between Jesus and the people whom John calls the Jews. It's very interesting how the Jewish leaders in Matthew, Mark, and Luke become the Jews in general in John's Gospel. The man born blind in chapter 9 of John's Gospel is one really long miracle story. In fact, one of the characteristics of the miracle stories in John's Gospel is that they're always longer than they are in the synoptics, at least as a rule. I'm pretty sure they are always longer. And there's much more made of the miracle story itself in his gospel. And this story here in chapter 9 is just loaded with there's humor in here almost. I'm not going to read it for you, but I would encourage you to read the story. But anyway, it starts, let's see, well, verse 1 of chapter 9. Jesus walked along, saw a man blind from death, And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Notice they've already introduced this into a theological discussion, which is very different than the miracles in the synoptics. And Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. And this is typical of John's use and description of the miracles, that their purpose is to illustrate something else. Again, it doesn't mean Jesus didn't care for the people who did this, but they have another level of function, which fits perfectly with everything in John's gospel, the Johannine technique of misunderstanding, that there's always another message, there's something else going on here, because the Logos is involved. Jesus as the Word of God, God incarnate, who comes to bring knowledge of God. Anyway, Jesus heals him. Verse 6, this is a unique kind of healing. Jesus, when he had said this, he spat on the ground, made mud with the saliva, and spreads the mud on the man's eyes, and says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And he went and washed and came back able to see, and the neighbors and those who had seen him say, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? And they say, it's he. And this whole debate about this, but here it's not just touch. It's Jesus takes some spit and makes some mud and spreads it on the man's eyes. This is a unique kind of miracle in the New Testament, certainly of Jesus's miracles. I'm thinking now there's of course the miracle connected with the eyes with Saul, who would become Paul in the book of Acts, but that's not a miracle that Jesus performs. It is, although I guess you could say indirectly, but God revealed Jesus to Paul, is described in that. So anyway, it's not directly a miracle of Jesus, nevertheless. The resuscitation of Lazarus, again, as I mentioned earlier, is a story. If you've not read it, you really need to. Once again, it's long. You can just see by the number of verses there in chapter 11. It's long, but it's powerful. And again, there's some powerful emotions in it. This is where Jesus actually begins to cry. And so he's so moved by the love that the people have for Lazarus, and maybe even by his own love for Lazarus. I think both of those interpretations are possible. All right, that's really all I wanted to say about the miracles. Jesus is miracle worker. Don't forget that when we're talking about the historical Jesus and everything, that one of the firm things we're pretty confident of was that Jesus had a reputation as being a miracle worker. Again, that's not historical proof that Jesus worked miracles. That's a matter of my faith and yours, I hope. But it certainly does give a good historical base for the notion that indeed Jesus had a solid reputation as a miracle worker, and that what we see in the Gospels is just part of that. All right, that's the end of this lecture. I told you this one would be shorter, and I still miss you, and I hope, again, that you all are well. Goodbye.